In the late 1980s, the French town of Annemasse in Haute-Savoie was gripped by fear. Girls and young women were becoming targets of a dangerous criminal, attacked on the street, in elevators, or on stairwells. There was no safe haven, not even under the roof of their own homes. He would suddenly ambush his victims, bind them, gag them, and subject them to violence. Not all would survive encounters with the maniac. This investigation would yield many clues before the killer, with his particularly disturbing modus operandi, was unmasked. The press dubbed him the Monster of Annemasse, as if the perpetrator of these atrocities were not human. But the true horror lies in the fact that he was human, a fellow resident of Annemasse just like his young victims. This story began in March 1986 in the town of Annemasse, located in Haute-Savoie, near the Swiss border. On March 13th at 5:15 p.m., 13-year-old Guillaume Bouvier returned home from school. He wasn't alone, he was with his friend, Jérôme. The boys approached the apartment door, and Guillaume was about to turn the handle and enter, as he usually did. But to his surprise, the door was locked. He was puzzled, as his younger sister Sophie was always the first to come home from school. 10-year-old Sophie Bouvier was a very well-behaved girl, but she often ignored their mother's request to lock the door. Of course, Guillaume had his own set of keys somewhere at the bottom of his school bag. He searched for them, found them, and unlocked the door. Letting Jérôme in and stepping inside, Guillaume noticed a letter opener on the hallway table, one he had never seen before. He heard the sound of running water coming from his mother's room, and a few drops of water had somehow made their way into the hallway. Apart from this, the apartment was unusually quiet. As Guillaume wondered what it all could mean, the door to his mother's room suddenly opened, and a stranger stepped out. The man appeared completely calm and relaxed. He looked very young, and Guillaume thought he might be the older brother of one of Sophie's friends. In other words, the confused boy was trying to make sense of the stranger's presence in his home. Meanwhile, the man casually asked if Guillaume knew where his sister Sophie was. Guillaume, bewildered, shook his head. At that moment, the phone rang. Guillaume knew it was his mother calling. She phoned at the same time every day to make sure both of her children had made it home safely from school and that everything was okay. Guillaume approached the phone to answer it. It really was their mother. She asked if Sophie had come home, because when she called earlier, her daughter hadn't answered. Guillaume replied, "No, Mom, Sophie isn't here," and then asked who the man was that he had just encountered in their apartment. By then, the man had opened the door and left just as Guillaume picked up the phone. His mother didn't understand what man he was talking about and asked her son to check again if Sophie was really not home. Guillaume and Jérôme began searching the rather spacious apartment together. Guillaume opened the bathroom door and was paralyzed with horror. His little sister, young Sophie, was there. She was lying in the bathtub, submerged in water, completely naked. Her ankles and wrists were bound, tape was wrapped over her eyes, and a gag was stuffed in her mouth. Guillaume rushed to call for emergency services, while Jérôme carefully pulled the girl out of the water. He removed the gag from her mouth and attempted to administer first aid. Soon, emergency responders arrived and quickly took Sophie to the hospital. It was standard procedure, but they already knew that Sophie had died, and there was nothing they could do to save her. The police who arrived at the scene discovered that young Sophie Bouvier lived in a fairly upscale neighborhood with her mother and older brother. Her parents were both doctors. Her father had passed away just a year before Sophie's murder, and her mother, Michelle Bouvier, worked as a factory physician. Michelle was an exceptionally attentive and caring mother. Sophie attended school and spent her free time practicing dance. The school was only 300 meters away from her home, so all she had to do was cross the square to get back. Sophie would always come home at the same time each day. However, she had a habit of forgetting to lock the door, so her mother had attached a note to the door that read, "Sophie, be careful. Lock the door when you are alone in the apartment." Every day at the same time, her mother would call to make sure Sophie had returned home safely. This time, when Sophie didn't answer, her mother grew very worried. In the apartment, the police found the items the perpetrator had used: a gag, ropes, and adhesive tape. The gag was a pair of underwear cut in half and wrapped with adhesive tape to ensure it stayed securely in her mouth. The autopsy revealed that the killer had drowned Sophie in the bathtub. There were no signs of violent assault, but the perpetrator had touched her in intimate areas. The police found traces of male semen on a towel, indicating that the assailant had gratified himself without directly assaulting the girl. However, in 1986, semen evidence could not aid the investigation, as DNA analysis was not yet available. Sophie's older brother Guillaume and his friend Jérôme were questioned about the stranger they had seen in the apartment. The boys described a tall and very thin young man, wearing glasses with thick frames and dressed in plain brown clothing, more suited for an elderly person. The boys helped the police create a composite sketch of the suspect. The murder of the 10-year-old girl undoubtedly sent shockwaves through the city. The police were under immense pressure, but the investigation proved difficult as the killer had left very few clues. There was only a partial fingerprint, which was insufficient for any substantial use, and traces of semen found on the towel. The only witnesses, young Guillaume and Jerome, were traumatized and had only seen the murderer for a few seconds, so they couldn't provide a detailed description. However, the investigators weren't entirely at a dead end, because this crime reminded them of another similar case. The detectives remembered an attack that had occurred just 8 months prior, in June of the previous year, and in the same neighborhood. On June 21, 1985, 8-year-old Angelique was heading home for lunch. She entered the elevator of her building, followed by a man who pressed the button for the basement. Without wasting any time, the man attacked her, dragged her into the basement, tied her hands behind her back, sealed her mouth with adhesive tape, placed a noose around her neck, and began cutting her clothes with scissors. He then removed the tape from Angelique's mouth and ordered her to satisfy him. However, he did not kill his victim. He left Angelique sitting on a garbage bin with a bag over her head and fled the scene. But the nightmare was far from over for the young girl. In tears, she made her way back to the elevator where the man had attacked her. When she entered the elevator, the rope around her neck got caught in the door. Thankfully, the elevator's safety mechanism was triggered and it stopped. Had the elevator moved slightly higher, the rope would have strangled Angelique. She was found in the elevator, crying and screaming, but alive. Unfortunately, she was too traumatized to help create a composite sketch of the attacker, and the investigation into Angelique's assault remained stalled for 8 months. The assault on Angelique and the murder of Sophie bore several similarities, particularly in the way the attacker had cut the victim's clothing. A week after Sophie's murder, her mother contacted the police, reporting that she had found the clothes Sophie was wearing on the day of her death. The clothing had been hidden in a closet and was cut into pieces. Investigators had to acknowledge that a dangerous predator was at large, a rapist and killer who followed a ritualistic pattern, revealing a deeply unsettling personality. Continuing their investigation, the detectives found a third similar case that had occurred 3 months earlier. On December 14, 1985, 12-year-old Stephanie returned home from school. She entered the elevator, and a young man followed her in, pressing the button for the basement. When he attacked her, Stephanie screamed. The man threatened, "If you scream, I'll kill you, but if you stay quiet, I won't do anything." Of course, the girl didn't believe him. Stephanie kept screaming. The man dragged her into the basement, where to her horror, she saw a mattress laid out on the floor. The stranger placed her on the mattress, shoved a cloth into her mouth, which turned out to be a piece of his underwear, taped her eyes shut, and tied her up. He threatened her with a piece of glass he found nearby and began touching her intimate areas. Stephanie didn't stop fighting. Then the man started to strangle her, simultaneously blocking her nostrils. The girl panicked. She couldn't breathe anymore and realized he was going to kill her. She decided to act as if she were dead to make her attacker leave her alone. The trick worked. The man fled, and Stephanie survived. The girl described the same man to the police that Guillaume and Jerome had seen. The criminal was young, but looked like an old man because of his clothing. He had clearly prepared for the attack, as he had laid out the mattress and left pieces of tape stuck to the walls, which were meant to aid him in his sinister task. Sophie and Angelique's homes were 100 meters apart. Stephanie lived less than a kilometer away from the girls. So before Sophie's murder, 2 attacks on girls had taken place in the same area over the span of a few months. Why then did Sophie's mother allow her to return home alone? Because she had no idea about the other elevator attacks. These incidents hadn't been reported due to the upcoming elections, so the media didn't raise the alarm. But after Sophie's murder, it became impossible to conceal that a dangerous criminal had appeared in the city, attacking children in their own homes. The man himself resembled a teenager, though he wore strange clothing. It was then that the press coined the nickname the Annemasse monster for him. Needless to say, all the parents were in a panic. No child was allowed to return home alone anymore. Police officers stood guard at the entrances to schools. Meanwhile, the police combined the 3 attacks into one case. However, aside from the description of the man, they still had nothing to go on. The letter opener led nowhere, as it was the most common model. As for the underwear the criminal used as a gag, the police went to stores that sold similar items and showed them a composite sketch. But it was all in vain. The police decided to share their only lead, the composite sketch, with the public. They sent the sketch to the media in the hope that someone would recognize the criminal. However, it was almost like hoping for a miracle, because the man in the composite sketch had no distinguishing features. He looked like any ordinary young man, resembling an office worker. It was no surprise that when the image of the killer appeared in the press, the police were overwhelmed with a flood of phone calls. Everyone in the city believed that their neighbor was the murderer. Hundreds of calls, each one needing to be investigated. They took up a lot of officers' time. A month after Sophie's murder, a report came in about a truly suspicious man. He was seen standing near a school, not just any school, but the one Sophie had attended. The suspicious man had been noticed by the parents of students. The police set up an ambush, and the man soon appeared. During the arrest, he trembled like a leaf and began crying. He was taken to the station for identification. Sophie's brother Guillaume and his friend Jerome immediately pointed to the suspect. However, the man had an alibi for the day of the murder. He was a bank employee and had been at work on March 13th at 5:15 p.m., as confirmed by his boss. So what had he been doing near the school? The man confessed that he wasn't interested in little girls, but rather a young, attractive woman who drove her son to school. He had been gathering the courage to talk to her for several days. Thus, it was yet another false lead. But still, Guillaume and Jerome had both identified the man. After the boys made the mistake, the police decided to protect them from frequent lineups to avoid compromising their testimonies. However, fate intervened when the teenager unexpectedly encountered the killer himself. On February 11, 1987, 14-year-old Guillaume was walking through the center of Annemasse when he suddenly noticed a man he had seen at his house on that fateful day. He was as shocked as he had been during their first encounter, but there was no doubt in his mind that this was his sister's killer. The man also noticed the boy and quickly entered a nearby store. Guillaume followed him into the store, moving between the aisles. The man went outside, looked around, saw the boy still following him, crossed the street, quickened his pace, and entered a bar. Guillaume hid behind a car and waited. The man did not leave the bar. The boy really could have used a mobile phone, but at that time they simply didn't exist, so Guillaume ran to the nearest phone booth and called the police. The police arrived very quickly and cordoned off the bar, but the man was already gone. While the boy was calling the police, he had slipped away. No one had ever doubted that the killer and rapist was a local resident. Now that assumption was confirmed. Sophie's mother found it hard to push away the thought that the killer was living his life freely. On a sunny day, she thought he was probably sitting on the terrace of a cafe, drinking coffee, while her daughter Sophie lay in a cold grave. Nevertheless, Sophie's mother and brother continued to live in the same apartment. At first, her mother had wanted to move, but then she realized that it was their home, the place where they had been happy as a family, where Sophie had been happy. On the other hand, thanks to Guillaume's accidental encounter with the suspect, the police were able to improve and update the composite sketch of the suspect. Now the man was depicted wearing round metal frame glasses and had grown a mustache. The updated sketch was once again published in the media in the hope that someone would recognize the changes in the appearance of someone they knew. Indeed, the police were once again flooded with calls. Officers followed up on each lead, but once again, they received no results. 2 more years passed. On a cold January day in 1989, 15-year-old Sylvie came home from school. She took out her keys in front of her apartment door, unlocked it, and was about to enter as usual when someone suddenly attacked her from behind and shoved her into the apartment. The girl immediately screamed. The stranger tried to choke her with one hand, but she managed to break free and screamed again. In the hallway of the apartment, there was a low table with a vase on it. While Sylvie struggled with the attacker, the vase crashed to the floor. This startled the man, and he ran away. The police immediately interviewed the girl, and here's what she described. The attacker had covered his face with a stocking, so she couldn't identify him, but he was tall, thin, and wearing gloves. He hadn't had the chance to tie her up with ropes or cover her eyes with tape, but he was holding a small bottle with a clear liquid that resembled water. The police speculated that it was chloroform, which meant the suspect they were looking for was evolving and seeking new ways to quickly and effectively incapacitate his victims. They were convinced that the man who attacked Sylvie was the Annemasse monster. Yes, Sylvie was a little older than his previous victims, and he didn't have ropes or tape, but there were many other similarities. His build, the way he attacked, and the gloves. After all, at Sophie's crime scene, forensic experts hadn't found any fingerprints either. 6 months later, another attack occurred. On August 20th, 1990, 21-year-old Natalie was returning from a party at 1:30 in the morning. She had gotten a bit lost and was walking along a bridge leading to the highway when a man suddenly attacked her from behind. He dragged her under the bridge, tied her up, undressed her, and was about to assault her when Natalie, who had some developmental disabilities, unexpectedly consented. However, the man had planned to commit violence, not engage in consensual sex, and, shocked and confused by this turn of events, he abandoned the bound, naked girl and ran away. Natalie was found wearing only her bra with her clothes cut to pieces. At the station, Natalie told the police that the man had a stocking on his head, so she couldn't see his face. But she remembered that he had a backpack and a small glass bottle. He poured liquid from the bottle onto a piece of cloth, then held it to her face, causing her consciousness to become foggy. This confirmed the hypothesis of chloroform use. The police observed a clear evolution in the killer's modus operandi. He was no longer the one who prowled apartments and basements. Now he was moving around the city center with a backpack containing ropes, tape, and chloroform. The police decided to act on this new information. They started stopping all men aged 25 to 30 moving through the city with a backpack. This wasn't an entirely unrealistic task, because according to the 1990 census, Annemasse had a population of 27,500. Their persistence paid off. One deep March night in 1991, officers were called to a burglary scene. While working at the crime site, they accidentally noticed a man with a backpack who tried to flee when they arrived. The man was quickly caught and thrown to the ground. He was wearing a woman's stocking around his neck, wrapped as if it were a scarf, which appeared suspicious. They searched his backpack, and inside they found ropes, duct tape, and chloroform. The man was taken to the station, where investigators discovered his name, Lucien Gilles Devalier. He was 24 years old. The investigators asked him what he was doing out so late with all these items in his backpack. The man claimed that he had been attacked some time ago and was looking for his attackers. However, he couldn't explain why he thought he would find them in that particular area at that hour, nor why he had run from the police when they arrived. At that moment, the investigator realized that the man sitting before him resembled the suspect they had been searching for over the past 6 years. However, the young man had no prior police record. The police decided to search his home, where he lived with his mother. On his desk, they found a camera. The window was covered with thick paper with a small round hole in it, perfect for a camera lens. They also found 2 large folders, neatly containing 4,200 photographs of girls, young women, and women. Lucien Gilles Devalier had been photographing women walking down the street, exiting stores, and getting into cars. He had categorized them by hair color, brunettes, blondes, and brunettes, and had rated them. Some photos included addresses and phone numbers. Additionally, officers discovered adult magazines and clippings from newspapers about the Annemasse monster. The officers had no doubt. They had found the Annemasse monster, but the police had little evidence. The composite sketch had been circulating for 6 years, and all the photographs and notes would be of little use in court. So the investigator decided to bluff. He told the suspect that, with all the materials they had found, they had a serious case against him, and the young man confessed. Later, he explained that he thought they would beat him, which is why he confessed. In any case, it turned out that he remembered every attack in the finest detail, recalling each one almost minute by minute. But that wasn't all. He also confessed to other attacks that the police didn't know about. He had assaulted 3 girls in Geneva and 3 more in the outskirts of Annemasse. With the exception of one incident where his victim was a 15-year-old girl, he typically targeted older girls. The attacks took place in parking lots or simply on the street, so he didn't always have time to pull out ropes or tape. This is probably why these incidents hadn't initially been connected to him. Most of these were unsuccessful attacks for him because the girls fought back and screamed, forcing him to flee quickly. Once he came close to being caught. In January 1991, he targeted a new victim. He had seen her close the blinds in her house and hastily concluded that she lived alone. The rapist broke into the house and attacked the girl in the bathroom. She screamed and her boyfriend rushed to help. The man chased the attacker, but during the pursuit, he tripped, fell, and injured his arm so badly that he could no longer work as a mechanic. Lucien Gilles Devalier managed to escape and continued planning his future attacks. It turned out that the guy killed Sophie when he was only 18 years old. How did he come to commit murder at such a young age? There were many events in his life that could explain this. Of course, not justify, but only explain. His mother adored him, doted on him, and spoiled him. His father, a brilliant mathematics teacher on the other hand, was quite strict and unemotional. The family relationship wasn't the warmest, but overall, he had a happy childhood. That is, until a man in his 50s lured him into a basement when he was 9 years old. He forced the boy to give him pleasure. The boy was in shock after what happened, and he found it difficult to tell his parents. So he wrote everything down in a letter. But his parents did nothing, fearing scandal. They told him not to talk to anyone about it. When the boy's parents did not go to the police, it was as if they were telling him, "You can survive such a horrifying event and the law will not intervene." The parents acted as if nothing had happened. The result was inevitable. The boy brushed his teeth 10 times a day, as if trying to wash away the dirt of what had happened. From a very young age, he developed a passion for sadomasochism. He would tie himself up, put a gag in his mouth, and inflict pain on himself. By the age of 12, he began dressing as a girl. At first, only at home, but by the age of 16, he would go out in public dressed that way. Later, he admitted how much he wanted someone to attack him. By then, his parents had divorced, and he lived with his mother. When his mother found his women's clothing, she did not attempt to understand what was happening with her son, but simply threw them away. At that moment, Lucien Gilles de Vallière transformed from a victim into a predator. He no longer saw women as individuals, but as objects, wanting them to submit to his desires. He said that he had been in love with a girl during his teenage years, and saw in Sophie's smile the smile of that girl he had loved, except that Sophie was only 10 years old. Before attacking her, he scoped out the area. He rode the elevator with her a few times, even learned her name through a brief exchange of polite words. A few days later, he returned and hid in a storage room, waiting for Sophie to come home. Once inside the apartment, he gagged her and stripped her naked. Sophie was undoubtedly terrified, clutching her teddy bear as if it could protect her. It's difficult to imagine what she felt when she heard the phone ring. She knew it was her mother calling and probably thought her mom would come to her rescue. Meanwhile, the attacker led Sophie to the bathroom, as it was part of his fantasy. He was aroused by the wet bodies of young girls. After satisfying his lust, he held Sophie underwater with his foot until she stopped moving. A few days after killing Sophie, he wrote in his diary, "It wasn't so bad." While he continued to commit crimes that grew more horrific, he seemed perfectly integrated into society. Lucien Gilles de Vallière was an excellent student, loved roller skating, was interested in computers, and dated girls. 3 months after he killed Sophie, holding her underwater with his foot, he successfully enrolled in an undergraduate program. At the time of his arrest, he was studying chemistry at the University of Geneva. The young man seemed to suffer from a split personality, though psychiatrists disputed this. He was evaluated by 2 psychiatrists and a psychologist who concluded that he was exceptionally intelligent, experienced no hallucinations, delusions, or schizophrenia, and was fully aware of his actions. This meant he was fit to stand trial. Thus, he was initially tried for acts of violence and sentenced to 7 years. On December 6, 1993, he appeared in court for the murder of Sophie, the attempted murder of Stephanie, and the assault of Natalie, who suffers from developmental disabilities, which served as an aggravating factor. When he took the stand, according to his lawyer's recollections, he looked like a movie star, a horror movie star, 6 feet tall, weighing around 130 pounds with a childlike face. When he spoke, he did so entirely without emotion. He explained that he hadn't intended to kill Sophie, but when he saw the water in the bathtub, he felt an impulse he couldn't resist. He told the murdered girl's mother that he felt disgusted with himself, and if his death could bring her daughter back, he would give his life immediately and without hesitation. He claimed he'd used warm water when he filled the tub for Sophie, as if that made any difference. Lucien Gilles de Vallière felt no remorse. Unlike many defendants, he didn't put on a show. He remained cold, detached, and rather self-centered. For example, when the investigator wanted to reenact the crime, the young man refused to go. The police insisted. Then he stated, "What you're doing is inhumane, bringing me to that place." A psychiatrist who took the stand testified that the young man was extremely dangerous because he used his sharp mind and meticulousness in service of his impulses to rape and kill. He experienced some difficulties in sexual matters, which drove him to seek new forms of gratification. At that time, psychiatry had no treatment to offer him. Experts unanimously affirmed that he was beyond rehabilitation. According to his lawyer, there should have been 4 people in the defendant's place: Lucien Gilles de Vallière himself, the 50-year-old man who had assaulted him, and his parents. After all, his mother saw all the evidence in her son's room, but never did or said anything. Doesn't she bear some responsibility for his actions? Despite all of the lawyer's efforts, the court did not take any mitigating circumstances into account. The 26-year-old man was found guilty of the assault and murder of Sophie, as well as attacks on 2 other girls. He was sentenced to the maximum punishment, life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. However, he appealed this decision, eventually securing eligibility for parole after 22 years. Despite numerous attempts to gain release, he is still serving his sentence in prison. After all, he's relatively young and could easily ruin more lives if released. But if he couldn't secure his freedom, he aimed to have his case forgotten. The convicted man decided to take action and, in 2019, filed a request with Google to delist news articles about his case. His request was denied.